Today's daf is daf Yud Ches. We'll start here on daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, where we left off yesterday, 2 lines before the end of Yud Zayin Amud Beis. My love. Now, the Gemara here is relating to the suffix of Rav Ashi earlier on the Amud. Rav Ashi wanted to know about the case of Tamei Nazar, which means he accepted his Nazirus when he was in the Beis HaKvaros, and Rav Ashi vacillated on the question whether or not he requires Giluach on Yom Shvi L'Taroso or not. And the Svara to say that he does not require Tiglachas is because he doesn't bring a carbon. And in the language of Rav Ashi, he says, Kiboy Tiglachas, who has the mitzvah of Tiglachas? That's only a Nazir Torah Shenitma. But a Nazir who was Tamei before he was Makabel Nazirus, he doesn't need Tiglachas. Or should we say, no, there's no difference between the two. And to the same extent that a Nazir Torah Shenitma requires Tiglachas, so too a Nazir who was Tamei before he accepted Nazirus requires Tiglachas. And the Gemara now tries to prove one way or the other regarding the suffix of Rav Ashi. And we're talking now in the Gemara's premise that on the 7th day of his Tara, he requires Tiglachas. That's called Tiglachas Tuma. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that there's a chiyuv Tiglachas even in the case of a Tamei Shenazar. And the Gemara rejects this and says, Lo Tiglachas Tara. We're not talking about the Tiglachas at the end of the 7 days of Tara to leave the state of Tumah, but rather we're talking at the very end of his Nazirus when he has a chiyuv to be Megalech. Chachinami Mistabra. And now we start Daf Yud Ches for today. If you're going to entertain the possibility that we're talking about Tiglachas Tumah, is V'chiyah Mechiluto Milo Boy Tiglachas. In the case of a Mitzorah, he also likewise, we're talking about a Mitzorah Muchlat, requires Tiglachas. In fact, he requires Tiglachas on the first of the 7 days and again at the end of the 7 days. So how could the Brises say that during his period of Mitzorah Muchlat, his Seir is not considered royal Tiglachas? And the Gemara says, Lo. I can explain the Brisa as to why he's not royal Tiglachas, because Tiglachas the Nazirus Ketani. We're talking about not the Tiglachas of a Mitzorah, but rather Tiglachas to fulfill the mitzvah of Nazirus. So if he accepted Nazirus when he was in a Beis HaKvaros, then is it, in a normal case, if he did not contract Tumas Tzoras, then his Seir might very well be considered Seir Haton Tiglachas. And there's no difference, therefore, between a Nazir Torah Shenitma, who requires Tiglachas on Yom Shvi, and a Nazir Bekever, also requires Tiglachas B'Yom HaShvi. In the case of Mitzorah, there he doesn't have a status of Ton Tiglachas because his Tiglachas is not generated by his Nazirus, but rather by his Tumas Tzoras. Toshma. We're going to try to be poshet the suffix of Rav Ashi with the following brisa. And we're going to look into the parasha of Nazir in Naso. And the Torah says, V'chiyamus meis ola b'fesa pisom, v'time rosh nizra. And then the Torah says, V'gilach rosho b'yom ta'araso, b'yom hashvi galchenu, u'b'yom hashvini yovi shtei sorim, o shnei b'nei Yona el hakohen. So the Brisa darshans the following. We're talking about a Nazir Tahar because it says Yamus Meis Ola Befesa Fisom Vitime, etc. And therefore, the Brisa says, the Torah is referring to a case of a Nazir Tar who contracted Tumah, because the pasuk right afterwards says, Vayoma Rishonim Yiplu. So it must be that we're talking about a person who observed Nazirus of Tara. And now his Tumah will be Soser, his Nazirus of Tara. And the Torah is teaching us that Huton Havaras Seir, Vavos Tziporim, that he requires on the seventh day of his Tara to bring, first of all, for Tiglachas, that's called Havaras Seir, and secondly, Havas Tziporim means to bring the Karban Tuma on Yom HaShmini. So on the seventh day, he cuts his hair, and on the eighth day, he brings his Karban Tuma, which is Shtei Torim, Shnei Bnei Yonah, Echad L'chatos, Echad L'yola, V'chein Keves L'yoshim, fine. So what do we derive from this? The pasuk is coming as a mute, Rosh Nizro, to tell you that when it says Bayom Hashvi Yigalchenu, it's only referring to a Nazir whose Yomus Meis Ola Pesa Pisom V'Time Rosh, which means he was observing his Nazirus of Tara. And then he became Tameh. And on the seventh day of his Tara, he has to undergo Tiglachas. And who is this excluding? The liftar said Nazir Bekever, a Nazir who accepted upon himself Nazirus while he was in a Beis HaKfaros, and he was Tameh. She'ein ton avos seir v'avos siporin. He does not require neither a karban on Yom HaShmini nor tiglachas on Yom HaShvi, because he was already tamei when he was mekabel as nazirus, and the Torah, when it obligates these two chiyuvim of havaras seir and havas siporin, is referring specifically and exclusively to a tar shenitma. And the Brisa now explains the Havamina. What would have been the law had we not had this pasuk of Etime Rosh Nizro? Hadvarm Kal V'chomer. We would assume that certainly a Nazir Shekibel of Nazirus is more chamur, and for sure he would require Tiglachas and Karban. Why? Umatar shenitma, at least he was a tar. And yet, since he became Tameh, ton avos seir vavos siporin, he needs both Tiglachas and Karban. Is Misha Yatame B'tchila? Here's a more severe case, where from the get-go, when he was makabel upon himself Nazirus, he was already Betuma, and that's considered Tameh Yoser. He's like even more Tameh. Is certainly a Nudin, we would have thought, if not for the pasuk, she'eiton havar seir v'havar siporet. Tamalom v'time rosh nizro. He in the footnote he takes out these words, v'time rosh nizro. Anyway, so we derive from this that dafka misha yatar v'nitma. The Torah is specifically addressing the case of a Nazir Torah who became Tameh, Akos Medaber, Sheiton Avor Seva Avos Sipor, V'liftar es ha-Nazir shekibel ol alatzman Nazirus kshoy bekever, she'eno ton tiglachas v'tziporin. So here, from this brisa, we have an explicit answer to the original suffix of Rav Ashi. He was wondering whether a tamei shehizer asmo is chayav in tiglachas, and the answer is that from this brisa we see clearly that he's not chayav in tiglachas to the same extent that he's not chayav in karban, and that's based on the diuk of Vitime Rosh Nizr. Now the Gemara goes back to a brisa that we brought back on Daf Yud Zayin, Mantana, who's the author of the Brisa? It says in the Brisa, Ein bein Tomi shenazir l'nazir tar shenitma. Ella, the only difference between the two is Tomi shenazar, that's he accepted upon his Nazirus when he was in the Beis HaKvaros, is Shvi shalo olo lo min haminyan. The seventh day of his Tara is the first day of his Nazirus Tara. The seventh day of his process of Tara allows him to start the kickoff of his Nazirus of Tara. And this means that on the seventh day of his Tara, after he had the Hazas Mechatos and he was Tovel, he can immediately begin counting his Nazirus of Tara. And it means that the seventh day of his Tara is the first day of his minyan of Yemei Nazirus to Tara. However, v'nazir tar shenitma ein shvi shalo ola min haminyan. The seventh day is not considered the first day of Nazir's Tara. And the reason for that is because he has to wait till the next day to bring his karbonos. So he really hasn't achieved and left the state of Tumah until the eighth day. So therefore, on the eighth day, and not before that, he begins counting his Yemei Nazirus to Tara. Now, in the footnote, he asks, why didn't the Brisa mention another distinction between Tomesh and Nazir Tosh and Nitma? And that's as far as the Havas Karban is concerned. There's no mention of Havas Karban. Says Rabbeinu Peretz that distinction is already included in the Brisa. The reason why a Nazir on the seventh day, that's a Tomesh Nazir, excuse me, on the seventh day counts it as the first day of his Nazirus of Tara, is because he doesn't have to wait to complete his Tara until he brings his Karbonos Tumah B'Yom HaShmini. But in the case of a Nazir Tar Shenitma, he has to bring his Karbonos Tumah on the eighth day, and that's why he cannot begin to count his Nazirus to Tara until Yom HaShmini. So that's all included here. Rav Chisda, this Brisa is Rebbe. Can be attributed and must be attributed to Rebbe. The Omar Rebbe, and we'll see that Rabbi Yossi Bar Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion, but Rebbe's opinion is, with regard to a Nazir Tar Shenitma, ein Nazirus Tara Chala Ela Ad Shmini, that he can only begin counting his Nazirus of Tara on the eighth day, because that's the day that he brings his Karban. And we're going to have a whole discussion, as we soon see, about the Laila, the night before Shmini, going into Shmini, where that itself is also considered as if he entered into the Chiyuv of Havas Karban Tumah. But now we're holding that since the Beis HaMikdash is closed for business at night, and the earliest time you could bring the Karbanos of Tumah is in the morning on Yom HaShmini, therefore he cannot count his Yemei HaNazirus until Yom HaShmini. And therefore, according to Rebbe, the difference between a Tomesh Nazir and a Nazir Tar Nitma is that only in the case of Nazir Tar Nitma, since he's chayiv in a Karban Tumah, and that's only going to be on the eighth day, therefore he cannot count his Nazirus of Tara until the eighth day. But in the case of a Tomesh Nazar, since he doesn't have a Chiyuv Karban Tumah, he can already begin to count his Nazirus on Yom HaShvi. Says the Gemara, Rav Chisda, how do I know for sure that it can't be the Bar Plukta of Rebbe? And that's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Tema, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Ha'amar. It's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda who says that even in Nazir Tar Nitma, he starts his minyan of Nazirus to Tara Mishvi Yehuda Chayla on the seventh day. On the seventh day of his Tara, he already could begin counting the Yemei Nazirus to Tara. We'll have to see exactly why. He has a special Gzeres HaKosuv from the Pasuk B'Yom Hahu. So already on the seventh day of his Tara, he begins counting, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, the minyan of Yemei Nazirus to Tara, And therefore, a Nazir tar shenitma, who according to Rabbi Yossi begins counting his Yimei Nazir's Tetar and Yom Shvi, then it's impossible to explain this brisa according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because the brisa itself explicitly says, Ein Hashvi Shalo Ola Min Aminya. That's against Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. My Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Where do we learn this machlokas between Rabbi and Rabbi Yossi about whether or not the seventh day of Tara in the case of a Nazir Tar Shenitma is Ola Lo Min Aminyan or not? This Sanya we learned in a brisa, and now we're darshaning again in the parsha of Nazir, where it says that a Nazir who is tar to maso is by Yom HaShmini Yovish Dei Sorim O Shnei Bnei Yonah El HaKohen El Pesach Ol Moed V'Osa HaKohen Echel Echat Ezech Li'ol V'Chipro Lo Me'asher Chot Al Nefesh V'Kidesh Es Rosho Bayom Hu, which means that he begins to count his Yimei Nazir's Tetara on that day. What day are we referring to? So if you take a look in the pasuk, we're talking about Yom HaShmini, the day that he brings his korban. Yom HaVos Korban Osav, Divrei Rebbe, that's Rebbe Shita, that only on the eighth day, when he's able and he's chayiv to bring his korbanos of Tumah, only then does he begin to count the Yimei Nazir's Tetara. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he disagrees. And he says that when the Torah adds the words by Yom Ahu, it's referring not to the seventh day, not to the eighth day, but rather to the seventh day. And that means that he begins to count his Nazir's Tara b'Yom Tiglachto, which is the seventh day of his Tara. And we'll soon see how the Gemara explains the derivation of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara brings now a Mishnah, and again wants to analyze who is the author of this Mishnah. So the Mishnah that we're about to begin now, which is the Mishnah on Daf Tes in Masechet Krisus, is going to occupy our minds for the balance of our Daf today. V'hodisnan, and the Gemara is going to analyze this Mishnah in terms of the machlokas Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Nazir shenitma tumas harbe eino mevi el korban echad. And this is very typical of Masechet Krisus, where you can combine different chiyuvei korban and kill many birds with one stone, with one korban. So now we're talking about a Nazir that contracted Tumah multiple times, and he's chayav a korban Tumah for each Tumah, yet we can combine them and collapse them into one single korban for all these Tumahs. Man, who is the author of this Mishnah? Now, before we get to Rav Chizda, let's explain. The Gemara's question Mantana is really based on a kasha that the Gemara has. The Gemara here doesn't spell out the kasha. What bothers us is the following. It's either A or we'll call it C in this case. We're going to skip B for a moment because that's what Rav Chizda is going to kind of work to come up with B. But we'll go now with the two simple possibilities or extremes, A and C. If we're talking about a case where the Nazir contracted Tumah many times before he even began his Tara, like for example, let's say he contracted his second Tumah on Yom Shishi L'Taraso. So why is that called in the language of the Mishnah Nitma Tumas Harbe? He never got out of one Tumah to get into another Tumah. So therefore he's obviously in one single Tumah, one long Tumah. So that's one extreme where he contracted his second Tumah on Yom Shishi. If on the other hand, the case that the Brisa that the Mishnah, is addressing is the case that he already was mitayr himself from his first tumah, and then he contracted tumah second time. How could he possibly bring one carbon for multiple tumas? Each tumah already generated its own chiyuv carbon independently. How do you collapse them into one carbon? So therefore, we're going to have to find a middle-of-the-road case. We'll call it case B, which, on the one hand, they're tumos harbe, but on the other hand, we can collapse these tumos into one entity and fulfill the chiyuv carbon of tumah with one single carbon for all those tumos. Amar Rav Chizda, the way to work out this Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehudahi, the Amar Nazir's Tara Miyom Shvi Chayla. So now we're going to Rabbi Yossi, who holds that you could begin counting Nazir's Tara already on Yom Shvi. Let's say because that's the day of Tiglachas Nazir, perhaps. Is Mishkachas Lo Kigon Shenitma, his second tumah was contracted B'Shvi, on the seventh day of his Tara. Okay, fine. So now, do we have? Now we can have Tumas Harbe because already on Yom HaShvi he begins counting in his Nazir's Tara. Now, v'chazav v'nitma, he again contracted Tumah, v'yom HaShvi, again beginning his process of Tara another time, when he gets the seventh day, once again he came in contact with a dead body and he contracted Tumah. And Kaven de lo yotza l'shar ruyal avi carbon, but even though there are Tumas Harbe, because already it's the first day of counting Nazir's Tara, but on the other hand, he doesn't bring his carbon until tomorrow. And that's called, in the language of Rav Chizda, lo yotza l'shah haru'uyal avi carbon. We should underline those words. It means that since the Nazir contracted Tumah before the moment of Hakravas carbon, Hakravas carbon is only possible on the 8th day, and yet he contracted Tumah before that on the 7th day, is therefore Eino Chayev El Carbon Echad. He can patter up all these tumas with one carbon tumah. So again, they're not considered one long tumah, all these tumas. They're considered multiple tumas harbe, because according to Rabbi Yossi, on the 7th day, he begins to count his Nazirus of Tara. So therefore it's called tumas harbe. And now we can combine them all into one single carbon because Adayin lo igia l'sharu ilavi carbon. The Itema Rebbe argues, Rav Chizda, that if you're going to attribute this Mishnah to Rebbe, who holds that he begins to count his Nazir's Tara only on the 8th day, when he can bring his carbon, so then I don't know what is the case of the Brisa. What's the scenario? If his second tumah was contracted on the 7th day of his Tara from his first tumah, again, he became Tomei. V'yom HaShvi is, if that be the case, Kulu Tuma Arichtahi. Right? On Yom HaShvi, he doesn't begin to count his Nazirus of Tara according to Rebbe. That's only according to Rabbi Yossi. So therefore, according to Rebbe, if he became Tomei on Yom HaShvi, then since he doesn't begin his Nazirus Tara, it's all considered one long Tumah. You can't justify the language of the Mishnah that the Tumas Harbe. Okay, so let's say that he contracted Tumah on the 8th day. So these are separate entities of Tumah. You cannot combine them and collapse them in any sense, in any shape or form, into one Tumah. Is therefore, Harayotza Shah Ruilavi carbon. On the 8th day, he's already roy to bring his carbon. So therefore, on that day that he contracts Tumah, which is day number 8, he has a chiyuv carbon. And if he contracts Tumah 8 days later on the 8th day, then again he has another chiyuv carbon Tumah. And therefore, for sure, he cannot bring one carbon for all these Tumahs. I'll read to you the translation. He says, Kevon shenitma b'yom hashmini li'achar shechol of chovas havas korban tuma. According to Rebbe, if we have to be talking in this particular scenario where he contract tumah on the 8th day, harei kamisha nitma li'achar shevias karbano. In other words, once the chi of carbon emerges, then that chi of carbon is, how shall we say, engraved in stone. And for sure, Vadai Sha'ol of Lavi Korban Tumah Nosaf al Tumah Shniya, and the same is for Tumah Shlishis, each Tumah generates its own Tumah. So how could the Mishnah Paskin that Eino Mevi El Korban Echad, and therefore you have no choice, says Rav Chizda, but to attribute this Mishnah to Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda, who holds that already on the 7th day, he can begin counting his Nazirus of Tara. And again, why, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, is he chayav only one carbon? And that's because we have to underline these words, since he contracted tumah before the chi of carbon emerges. So any chi of tumah is all included into one long chi of tumah, chi of carbon, even though again it's many tumahs, because he's already entered into the 7th day and the first day of his Nazir's Tara, so that when he contracted tumah, he now is already in a period of Nazir's Tara when he contracted tumah. That makes it tumas harbe, and once it's tumas harbe, now we can understand how we collapse it all into one carbon, because Adayin lo yatsa l'shah ru'yalavi carbon on the 7th day. Now the Gemara gets into an analysis of the Machlok Shin Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. My time of the Rebbe, why do you begin Nazirus of Tara only on the 8th day? Omar Kra, the Torah says with regard to Taras Nazir Shenitma, Ubayom Hashmini Yovi Shtei Torim O Shnei Bnei Yona El HaKohen El Pesach El Moed V'Yasa HaKohen Echel Echatas Echel Yolav V'Chiper Olav. And V'Chiper Olav is a reference to the carbon Me'asher Chot Al Nefesh. Chot Al Nefesh means because he contracted tumah, even though he didn't do it deliberately. V'Hadar, and afterwards the pasuk continues and says V'Kiddush is Rosho B'Yomahu, which means that he begins his Nazirus of Tara. So that the Seder Apsukim seems to indicate that B'Yomahu is referring to the day of V'Chiper Olav. The day of V'Chiper Olav is the day that he brings his carbon for Kapara, and that's Yom HaShmini. We have to keep in mind that according to Rebbe, the Gemara is going to say later on, that he begins counting his Nazirus of Tara on Yom HaShmini even before he brings his carbon tumah. So now the Gemara wants to know, so what does Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda do with this pasuk of a Kiddush es Rosh V'Yomahu? How can he begin counting his Nazirus Tara on Yom HaShvi? I mean, the pasuk seems to indicate V'Chiper Olav, that it's only when he's about to bring his carbon and he's chayav to bring his carbon, then the Kiddush es Rosh, only then can he begin to count his minyan of Nazirus of Tara. And the Gemara answers that according to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, there are two superfluous words in this pasuk. In Cain, if the Torah had in mind that he begins his Nazirus of Tara on Yom HaShmini, Lema Krava Kiddush es Rosho, it would have been sufficient for the Torah to say the Kiddush es Rosho, and we would understand that the meaning of this is for the Yom HaShmini, because that's what the pasuk is talking about, since it says the Chiper Olav, which is referring to Yom HaShmini when he brings his carbon. And therefore we have two words in the pasuk that are totally superfluous. And here we turn to Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis.